My wife slammed a manila envelope onto the frosting of my retirement cake while my children popped confetti cannons. I stood there, a 67-year-old man holding a glass of cheap champagne, watching the woman I had supported for 40 years announce to a room full of strangers that her gift to me was her freedom. She wanted a divorce, half my pension, and the house in Connecticut. My son Brandon clapped. My daughter Rachel cheered. They thought they had just won the lottery. I simply wiped a smudge of icing off the legal documents, uncapped my fountain pen, and signed. As I handed the papers back to her, I leaned in and whispered 5 words that she should have listened to. You just triggered the apocalypse. 6 months later, they were on their knees outside my apartment, but by then, the locks had already been changed. Before I tell you how I destroyed my own empire to save it, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you. The air in the banquet hall was thick with the smell of stale perfume and ambitious greed. It was supposed to be a celebration of 40 years of service as the chief financial officer for a logistics firm, but the guest list told a different story. My colleagues were not there. My old friends from the firm were missing. Instead, the room was filled with my wife Catherine's country club friends, my son Brandon's entourage of failed entrepreneurs, and my daughter Rachel's social media followers who were currently live streaming my humiliation. I tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the room, but before I could say a word about hard work or legacy, Catherine stepped up. She was wearing a red dress that cost more than my first car, a dress I had paid for, and she snatched the microphone from my hand with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Lawrence," she said, her voice amplified and echoing off the walls. "You have worked so hard to provide for us, but today marks a new chapter. You are retiring from work, and I am retiring from being your wife." The room went silent for a heartbeat, just long enough for the shock to register, and then came the sound that haunts me more than the divorce itself: the applause. It started from the corner table where my son Brandon sat with his wife Megan. They were laughing. Brandon, my 32-year-old son, who had never held a job for more than 6 months, was clapping for the end of my marriage. Next to him, my daughter Rachel raised her glass, shouting, "Finally, Mom, you are free." My son-in-law Travis, a man who could not sell a house in a seller's market, popped a confetti cannon. The glittering paper rained down on me like debris from a collapsing building. This was not a spontaneous outburst. This was a coup. I looked at the manila envelope sitting on the ruined cake. Petition for dissolution of marriage. They had planned this. They had orchestrated a public execution of my dignity, counting on my shame to force a quick settlement. Catherine looked at me, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She expected me to beg. She expected me to cry or yell or cause a scene that would justify her cruelty. She wanted the angry, controlling husband she had painted me to be in her stories to her friends. But I did not feel anger. Not yet. I felt a cold, mathematical clarity. I looked at the legal papers and then at my family. I saw them not as my flesh and blood, but as liabilities, assets that had depreciated to zero. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket, a suit I had bought 10 years ago, because I saw no need to waste money on fashion, and pulled out my Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was the only luxury item I allowed myself, a gift from my father, when I passed the CPA exam 40 years ago. Catherine's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She had expected resistance. She had armed herself for a war, bringing her shark of a lawyer, a man named Jameson, who was currently smirking by the bar. She was not ready for immediate surrender. "Sign it, Larry," she hissed, leaning in so only I could hear. "Don't make this difficult. I want half of the brokerage accounts, the house, and alimony. Jameson says we can drag this out until you are living in a cardboard box, or you can sign and keep your dignity." Dignity. That was a rich word coming from a woman who had just turned my retirement party into a circus. I looked past her at Brandon. He was already on his phone, probably looking up the price of sports cars. He thought the bank of Dad was about to be broken open and looted. He had no idea that the bank had a security system he had never bothered to ask about. I uncapped the pen. The black ink flowed smoothly onto the signature line. Lawrence Edward Bennett. I signed my name with a steady hand. The same hand that had signed billion-dollar merger contracts and authorized layoffs of thousands of employees during the recession. I knew how to cut losses. I knew how to stop the bleeding. As I finished the signature, I looked Catherine dead in the eye. Her triumph was starting to curdle into confusion. She snatched the papers from the table, checking to make sure I hadn't written an obscenity or a joke. It was a valid signature. "You have no idea what you just did, Catherine," I whispered, my voice low and level. "You think you just won the lottery, but you just triggered Clause 14B. She laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "What are you talking about, you old fool? There is no prenup. I know exactly what we own. We own the house in Connecticut. We own the investment portfolio. It is marital property." I simply capped my pen and placed it back in my pocket. "Enjoy the party," I said. "You are paying for it." I turned to walk away, the confetti crunching under my dress shoes. I did not look back at the cake. I did not look back at the banner that said "Happy Retirement." I walked toward the double doors, intent on leaving this toxic life behind me instantly. But they were not done with me. Brandon stepped into my path, his chest puffed out, a glass of scotch in his hand. He was wearing a suit that was too tight, a style he claimed was European, but just made him look desperate. "Going somewhere, Dad?" he asked, a smirk plastering his face. "Not so fast. We need the keys." I stopped. "The keys to what, Brandon? The keys to the Ford. You want my 10-year-old sedan?" "No." He laughed, glancing back at his wife, Megan, who was watching us with hungry eyes. "The credit cards. The keys to the house. Mom's lawyer said that since you are leaving the marital home, you can't take marital assets. We don't want you draining the accounts before the judge freezes them. Hand them over." I looked at my son. I remembered teaching him to ride a bike. I remembered paying for his private college tuition, which he wasted on a degree in philosophy he never used. I remembered the 3 startups I had funded, all of which failed, because he refused to wake up before noon. And now he was standing here acting as the enforcer for his mother's greed. He truly believed he was protecting his inheritance. He thought the money was a static thing, a pile of gold sitting in a vault waiting for him. He did not understand that wealth is a living thing, and I was the heart that kept it beating. "You want the wallet?" I asked. Brandon held out his hand, snapping his fingers impatiently. "Give it here. Mom needs to secure the liquidity." I pulled out my old leather wallet. It was worn at the corners. Inside there was a debit card, a corporate credit card, and about $40 in cash. I took the cash out and put it in my pocket. Then I slapped the wallet into Brandon's hand. "Here you go, son," I said. "You want the keys to the house?" I took the heavy brass ring from my pocket. The key to the front door of the $2 million colonial in Connecticut that Catherine loved so much. I dropped them into his palm. He closed his fist around them, his eyes lighting up with greed. He thought he was holding power. He was holding an anchor. "And the car keys?" Brandon demanded. "I want the keys to the Ford. You can take an Uber." I tossed the car keys at his feet. They clattered on the floor. Brandon laughed, kicking them aside. "Have a nice life, Dad. Don't worry about us. We will take good care of your money." I walked out of the banquet hall and into the cool night air. The noise of the party faded behind me, replaced by the sound of traffic and the wind in the trees. I stood on the curb, a 67-year-old man, with no car, no wallet, and no home. Any observer would have seen a pathetic figure, a man stripped of everything by a family of vultures. But I did not feel pathetic. I checked my watch. It was 8:03 p.m. A sleek black Lincoln town car pulled up to the curb silently. The rear window rolled down and a face I had trusted for 30 years looked out. It was Samuel Kaufman, my personal attorney, and the only man who knew where the bodies were buried. He did not smile. He simply unlocked the door. "Get in," Larry Kaufman said. "Did she do it?" I slid into the leather seat, the interior smelling of expensive leather and air conditioning. I closed the door, sealing out the humid night and the wreckage of my family life. "She did," I replied. "Served me publicly. Brandon demanded the keys and the cards. They have possession of the physical assets." Kaufman nodded, tapping a command onto his tablet. "And the signature I signed," I said, leaning back and closing my eyes. "The divorce is contested, but the separation date is established as of tonight. That means the trigger is active." Kaufman looked at me through the rearview mirror. "You know what happens next, Larry. Once I hit enter, there is no going back. The protocols are irreversible. The assets in the irrevocable trust are designed to protect the principal at all costs. If the beneficiary, that's you, is compromised by a hostile legal action, the liquidity dries up. The assets freeze. It is the nuclear option." I thought about Catherine's face when she demanded the house. I thought about Rachel's influencers posting my humiliation online. I thought about Brandon snapping his fingers at me for my wallet. They wanted the Bennett fortune. They wanted the lifestyle. They did not understand that Lawrence Bennett did not own anything. Lawrence Bennett was merely the manager of a very complex, very aggressive financial structure designed by my father and perfected by me to ensure that exactly this scenario could never happen. "Do it," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Shut it all down. Cancel the secondary cards. Revoke the authorized user status. Notify the leasing companies. And send the eviction notice to the Connecticut property. They want to play hardball. Let's show them what Major League pitching looks like." Kaufman hit the enter key. The screen on his tablet flashed green for a second, then settled into a processing bar. It was done. The financial veins that had pumped lifeblood into my ungrateful family for decades were severed. I wasn't just cutting them off. I was erasing the artificial reality they lived in. "Where to?" Kaufman asked. "The club, no," I said. "Take me to the city. I have a small apartment in the garment district that nobody knows about. It is under the LLC's name. It has a cot and a coffee maker. That is all I need. Tonight, I sleep like a baby. Tomorrow, the real show begins." As the car pulled away, I looked back at the banquet hall one last time. I could see the lights flashing through the windows. They were probably ordering expensive champagne, charging it to the credit card I had just handed Brandon. They would be toasting to their victory. They would be planning their shopping sprees and their vacations. They had absolutely no clue that the card in Brandon's pocket was already dead plastic. They didn't know that the house they were planning to return to was no longer their home. They were dancing on the deck of the Titanic, and I had just ordered the iceberg. The next morning, the sun rose over the city with a brilliance that felt like a personal endorsement from the universe. I woke up on the stiff mattress in my secret studio apartment, my back aching slightly, but my mind clear. I made a pot of black coffee and sat by the window, looking down at the busy street. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't have to go to the office. I didn't have to check the stock market for the company, and I didn't have to listen to Catherine complain that the pool boy hadn't cleaned the filter properly. My phone, a burner prepaid model I had purchased days ago, buzzed. It was a notification from the security system at the Connecticut house. Motion detected at the front gate. I opened the app, which I still had access to as the administrator of the trust. The camera feed loaded. It showed a tow truck, a very large, very aggressive repossession tow truck backing up to the driveway where Brandon had parked his Porsche and Rachel had parked her Range Rover. I took a sip of coffee and watched. This was scene 4 of my new life, and the script was playing out perfectly. The cars weren't owned by me, and they certainly weren't owned by my children. They were leased through a holding company under the corporate umbrella. One of the clauses in the lease agreement, a clause I had written myself, stated that upon the termination of my employment, or a change in my marital status, that threatened the assets, all company vehicles were to be returned immediately to the fleet. Since I had retired and divorced in the same hour, the contracts were void. On the small screen, I saw Brandon run out of the house in his silk pajamas. He was waving his arms, screaming at the tow truck driver. I couldn't hear the audio, but I could read his body language. He was shouting, "Do you know who I am?" The driver, a burly man who clearly did not care who Brandon was, simply hooked the chains onto the Porsche's axle. Brandon tried to physically block the truck. The driver stepped out, crossed his arms, and pointed a finger at my son. Whatever he said made Brandon step back. Then Catherine appeared. She was wearing a dressing gown, her hair in curlers. She was holding her phone, frantically tapping the screen. I knew exactly who she was trying to call. She was trying to call me. But my old phone was sitting in a trash can, 3 blocks from the banquet hall. She was trying to call the bank. But the bank was currently looking at a flagged account status that said, "Fraud alert, unauthorized access." The previous night, after Kaufman initiated the protocol, every credit card linked to my social security number and the joint accounts was frozen. When Catherine tried to pay the $25,000 bill for the retirement party, the card I handed Brandon would have declined. I imagined the scene. The waiter returning with that polite, pitying smile. The confusion. The second card being declined. The scramble to find cash. The humiliation of having to call one of her rich friends to bail her out. Now, watching the tow truck hoist the Porsche into the air, I saw the reality setting in. They were stranded. They were in a house that was about to eject them with no cars, no credit, and no cash. Rachel came out next, filming the tow truck driver with her phone, probably threatening to expose him to her followers. The driver ignored her and lifted her Range Rover next. I switched the camera view to the kitchen interior. I had cameras everywhere. I saw Megan, my daughter-in-law, pacing back and forth. She was on the phone with her mother. I turned up the volume on my tablet. "He must be insane," Megan was saying. "He cut us off. Everything is declined. Brandon's card didn't work at the gas station last night. We had to walk home. And now they are taking the cars. Mom, you have to send us money." I smiled. It was beginning. But the cars were just the appetizer. The main course was arriving in exactly 1 hour. Kaufman was sending the sheriff. You see, the house in Connecticut was never in my name. It was never in Catherine's name. It belonged to the Bennett Family Trust. We lived there as tenants. The rent was $1 a year, a symbolic gesture. But the lease agreement had a very specific termination clause. If the primary tenant, me, vacated the premises due to marital dissolution, the lease was voided for all occupants. They were now officially squatters. I watched as the tow truck drove away with their status symbols. Brandon kicked the gravel driveway, throwing a tantrum like a toddler. Catherine stood frozen, staring at the empty spots where the cars used to be. She looked old. The makeup couldn't hide the fear anymore. She realized that the man she called a cheapskate, the man she mocked for driving a Ford, was the only thing standing between her and the abyss, and she had just pushed me off the cliff. The phone buzzed again. It was Kaufman. "The sheriff is en route," he texted. "Eviction notice is being served at 10 a.m. They have 48 hours to vacate." I replied with a thumbs-up emoji. I poured another cup of coffee. I had a busy day ahead. I had a meeting with the new investment broker to restructure my personal portfolio, free from the encumbrances of a family that hated me. I had a lunch date with a woman named Elena, a history professor I had met at a library a month ago, someone who didn't know I was wealthy and didn't care. But first, I wanted to watch the sheriff arrive. I wanted to see the moment they realized that the divorce papers Catherine threw at me were not a ticket to freedom, but an eviction notice from their own lives. This was the education I should have given them 20 years ago. It was harsh, yes, But as any good CFO knows, sometimes you have to liquidate the bad assets to save the company. And my family. They were toxic assets. At 10:00 a.m. sharp, the sheriff's cruiser rolled up the driveway. I watched Catherine's face as the uniformed officer handed her the papers. She dropped them. She actually dropped them on the ground. She looked at the camera, the security camera she knew I had installed. She looked right into the lens, and for the first time in my life, I saw her beg. She mouthed the word Larry. I took a sip of coffee. "Sorry, honey," I said to the empty room. "Larry doesn't live there anymore. Protocol Omega is in full effect." While I sat in my studio apartment sipping black coffee, the morning sun was just beginning to stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the colonial mansion in Connecticut, a house that was currently hosting a victory breakfast for my soon-to-be ex-wife and her brood. I could see it all through the kitchen security feed on my tablet. They were gathered around the granite island I had paid for 3 times over, picking at a spread of gourmet pastries and drinking mimosas made with the vintage champagne I had been saving for my 70th birthday. Catherine looked radiant in her silk robe, the flush of what she thought was freedom coloring her cheeks. Brandon was there nursing a hangover and scrolling through his phone, probably reading the comments on the video of my humiliation. Rachel was taking selfies with the champagne flute, adjusting the lighting to make sure her followers knew she was living the high life. They looked like royalty, secure in their castle, unaware that the moat had been drained and the drawbridge was burning. The atmosphere of self-congratulatory bliss was interrupted by the arrival of Stefan, the owner of the high-end catering company that had serviced the retirement party the night before. He stood in the entryway looking uncomfortable, clutching a wireless payment terminal. I turned up the volume on my tablet. Stefan cleared his throat and apologized for the intrusion so early in the morning, but explained that there had been an issue with the final settlement of the bill the previous night. The total outstanding balance for the venue, the food, the staff, and the open bar was $25,000. Catherine waved a hand dismissively and told him not to worry. She reached into her purse and pulled out the platinum card, the one authorized on my primary account, the card she had used to buy jewelry and designer handbags for decades without ever looking at the price tag. She handed it to Stefan with the air of a queen granting a favor. Stefan inserted the chip. The machine beeped, a sharp, dissonant sound that cut through the morning chatter. Stefan frowned and tried again. Another beep. He looked at the screen and apologized, saying the card had been declined. Catherine laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. She told him that was impossible and that the limit on that card was astronomical. She told him to run it again. He did. Declined. The code on the screen was specific. Account closed. I watched Brandon step up, puffing out his chest. He told his mother not to stress and pulled out his own black card, the one I had given him for emergencies, which he interpreted as bottle service at nightclubs. He handed it to Stefan with a smirk. The machine beeped again. Declined. Brandon's smirk vanished. He pulled out another card. Declined. Rachel tried hers. Declined. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. Stefan was no longer smiling. He said he needed payment immediately, or he would have to involve the police, as this was technically theft of services. Catherine's face went pale. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number for Jameson, her shark of a lawyer. I could hear her frantic voice echoing in the kitchen. She was screaming that I had cut them off, that I was hiding assets, that she needed an emergency order to unfreeze the accounts. Then she went silent, listening to whatever Jameson was saying on the other end. I knew exactly what Jameson was telling her, because I had sent his firm a digital packet at midnight. I watched Catherine's legs give out. She slumped onto one of the bar stools, the phone slipping from her fingers. Brandon asked what was wrong. Catherine looked at her children with eyes wide with horror. She whispered that the accounts were not frozen. She said they didn't exist. Not for them. This was the moment the backstory they had ignored for 40 years finally caught up with them. You see, my father was a man who did not trust easily. When he built the foundation of the Bennett fortune, he did not put it in my name. He created the Bennett Investment Trust, an entity designed with ironclad bylaws to preserve capital for future generations, but only under specific moral conditions. I was never the owner of the fortune. I was merely the trustee, the guardian. The bylaws stated clearly that the primary beneficiary had full access to the funds for the maintenance of his lifestyle and family, only so long as the family unit remained intact. My father had written a poison pill clause specifically for the event of a divorce initiated against the bloodline beneficiary. It was called the Preservation of Capital Clause. The moment a petition for divorce was signed, the trust automatically reclassified all assets used by the spouse and adult children not as gifts but as unauthorized liabilities. The house, the cars, the credit lines, they were all legally property of the trust. And since the marriage was effectively over, the trust was legally required to liquidate those liabilities to protect the principal investment. Catherine was listening to Jameson explain that she had not just divorced a husband, she had divorced the money. The trust did not recognize her claim. The house was not marital property because it had been purchased by the trust 20 years ago and leased to us. The portfolio was not marital property because it was an inheritance vehicle protected by layers of corporate law that even Jameson could not penetrate. Brandon started screaming. He grabbed his mother's phone and yelled at the lawyer asking about his trust fund. I could almost hear Jameson's dry laugh on the other end. There was no trust fund for Brandon. There never was. I had given them allowances from my salary as the trustee. The actual trust capital was locked away, accessible only to me, and only for approved expenses. Divorce settlements were not approved expenses. The reality hit them like a physical blow. They were standing in a kitchen they did not own, eating food they could not pay for, wearing clothes that were suddenly their only assets. Rachel started crying, saying she couldn't be poor, saying it would ruin her brand. Brandon threw a glass across the room, shattering it against the fridge. Stephen, the caterer, cleared his throat again. He said he still needed the $25,000. Catherine looked at her children. She looked at her purse. She opened her wallet and pulled out a stack of cash, maybe $300. She put it on the counter. It was pathetic. I watched as the realization settled in. They had thought I was a stingy old man hoarding his millions. They didn't realize I was the dam holding back the floodwaters of reality. I had protected them from the complexity of the trust, I had managed the audits, I had filed the paperwork, and I had ensured the money flowed smoothly into their ungrateful hands. By serving me those papers, Catherine had blown up the dam. Now they were drowning, and the water was rising fast. The beautiful colonial house was no longer a home, it was a corporate asset scheduled for liquidation. The credit cards were just plastic. They had absolutely zero liquidity. Brandon turned to his mother, his face red with rage. He asked her what she had done. He asked her why she hadn't checked the financials before staging the coup. Catherine stammered. She said she thought it was all community property. She thought 50 years of marriage meant she owned half of everything. She didn't understand the difference between ownership and stewardship. I turned off the tablet screen. The coffee in my mug was cold, but it tasted like victory. They were beginning to understand. They were beginning to see the architecture of their own demise. But the lesson was not over. The eviction notice was still on its way, and the morning was still young. I washed my cup and prepared for my meeting with the new broker. I walked out into the bustling city street feeling lighter than I had in decades, leaving the silence of the dead feed behind me. While the chaos of the declined credit cards was still reverberating through the kitchen, I switched the camera feed to my home office, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather that I had forbidden anyone from entering for decades. Standing behind my desk, sitting in my chair, with his feet up on the polished wood, was my son-in-law Travis. He was holding a tape measure in one hand and his cell phone in the other, pacing the room with the swagger of a man who had just inherited a kingdom. I turned up the audio. Travis was practically shouting into the phone, his voice thick with unearned confidence. He was talking to a developer friend of his, a man I knew to be as shady as he was insolvent. Travis was telling him that the listing was going to be exclusive. He was bragging about the square footage, about the custom millwork, and about how he was going to fast-track the sale for cash. He said he was going to take a double commission on the deal. He called it the easiest flip of his life. He was already spending the money in his head, planning to upgrade his leased BMW to something he actually owned. It was pathetic. Travis was a realtor who had sold exactly 2 houses in 5 years, both to relatives who took pity on him. He didn't understand the first thing about property law, let alone the complex titling of a high-value estate held in a corporate trust. He thought possession was 9/10 of the law. He was about to learn that in my world, paperwork is the only law that matters. The front doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite chime of a guest. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of law enforcement. I saw Travis freeze. He told his friend he had to go and hung up. He smoothed his jacket, checked his reflection in the glass of my diploma frame, and walked out to the foyer expecting to greet a buyer. I switched the feed to the entryway camera. Catherine was already there, opening the massive oak double doors. Standing on the porch was Sheriff Miller, a man I had played poker with on Tuesdays for 10 years. Beside him stood Samuel Kaufman, looking like the Grim Reaper in a 3-piece charcoal suit holding a thick leather binder. Catherine forced a smile, a reflex from her days as a society hostess. She asked if everything was all right. She probably assumed I had been found in a ditch somewhere, or that I had been arrested for causing a disturbance. She was ready to play the grieving, confused wife. Sheriff Miller didn't smile back. He tipped his hat slightly and said he was there to escort Mr. Kaufman, who had legal documents to serve regarding the occupancy of the premises. Catherine frowned. She looked at Kaufman with disdain. She told him that if this was about the divorce papers, he could send them to Jameson. She tried to close the door. Sheriff Miller put a hand out, stopping the door firmly. He told her this wasn't about the divorce. It was about trespassing. Travis pushed past Catherine, trying to exert some alpha male dominance. He asked what was going on. He said this was private property and they couldn't just barge in. He pulled a business card from his pocket and tried to hand it to Kaufman, introducing himself as the listing agent for the estate. Kaufman looked at the card and let it drop to the floor. He didn't even blink. He stepped into the foyer, the sound of his dress shoes echoing on the marble. He opened the leather binder. He spoke with a voice that was calm, dry, and utterly destructive. He informed them that they were currently in violation of criminal trespass statutes. He stated that the property located at this address was the sole asset of the Bennett Real Estate Holding Group, a subsidiary of the Bennett Family Trust. He explained that there was no listing agent because the property was not for sale. Catherine laughed a sharp, hysterical sound. She screamed that this was her house. She said she had picked out the curtains. She said she had raised her children here. She yelled that her name was on the deed and that Jameson had assured her she had squatter's rights until the divorce was finalized. Kaufman pulled a document from the binder. It was a single page yellowed with age, protected by a plastic sleeve. He held it up for her to see. It was a residential lease agreement dated 25 years ago. He asked her if she recognized her signature. Catherine squinted at the paper. I watched her face go slack. She remembered. I had brought that paper to her 2 decades ago, telling her it was a tax formality, something my accountants needed to depreciate the asset. She had signed it between sips of wine without reading a single clause. Kaufman read the terms aloud for the benefit of the sheriff and the cameras he knew I was watching. The lease agreement stated that Lawrence and Catherine Bennett were tenants of the trust, renting the property for the sum of $1 per year. The lease was renewable annually. However, Clause 7, Paragraph C stated explicitly that the lease was contingent upon the continued employment of Lawrence Bennett as the trustee and the continuation of the legal marriage between the tenants. Kaufman looked over his glasses at Catherine. He told her that by filing the petition for dissolution of marriage the previous night, she had voluntarily terminated the qualifying condition of the lease. The contract was void the moment the court clerk stamped her filing. The dollar rent was no longer valid. Travis started shouting that it was a trick. He said a judge would never uphold it. He said it was marital fraud to hide the house in a trust. Kaufman turned to Travis and smiled a cold, reptilian smile. He told Travis that the trust had purchased the land 5 years before Lawrence had even met Catherine. It wasn't marital property because it had never belonged to Lawrence. It belonged to his father. Lawrence was just the caretaker. And now that the caretaker had been removed from the equation by his wife's legal action, the trust was reclaiming its asset. Catherine was shaking. She leaned against the wall for support. She asked what that meant. She asked where they were supposed to go. Sheriff Miller stepped forward. He said he had an eviction order signed by a judge that morning. He said the trust had declared the property at risk due to unauthorized occupants. He told them they had 48 hours to vacate the premises. Travis argued that they needed 30 days. He said tenant laws protected them. Kaufman corrected him. He said they weren't tenants. Since the lease was voided, they were technically intruders. The 48 hours was a courtesy, not a right. Then came the final blow. Kaufman looked around the foyer at the antique console table and the crystal chandelier. He consulted his list. He informed them that the eviction order applied to the structure and all fixtures and furnishings owned by the trust. He explained that the furniture, the art, the electronics, and even the silverware were all catalogued assets of the Bennett family trust. They were allowed to remove their personal clothing and toiletries. Everything else stayed. Catherine screamed. She lunged at Kaufman, trying to grab the binder. Sheriff Miller intercepted her gently, but firmly holding her back. He warned her that assaulting an officer of the court would result in immediate arrest, and she would spend the 48 hours in a cell rather than packing. I watched from my studio apartment, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic thud. It wasn't joy I felt. It was the satisfaction of a math problem finally solved. They had lived in a bubble of luxury, never asking who paid for the air conditioning. They assumed the lifestyle was theirs by right. They didn't understand that they were guests, and guests can be asked to leave. Travis was on his phone again, likely calling Jameson. But Jameson couldn't help them. The trust documents were ironclad, written by the best legal minds in the country, specifically to withstand this exact scenario. My father had warned me. He had said that money attracts parasites, even the ones you give birth to. He had built the castle walls thick and high. I had just raised the drawbridge. Kaufman handed Catherine a copy of the eviction notice. She took it, her hands trembling so hard the paper rattled. She looked around the foyer, the grand entrance she had used to impress her friends for years. It wasn't hers. It never was. She was a tenant who had just been fired. "Get packing, folks," Sheriff Miller said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'll have a deputy stationed at the gate to ensure nothing belonging to the trust leaves the property. You have until 10 a.m. on Thursday." Kaufman and the sheriff turned and walked out, the heavy doors closing with a finality that shook the frame. Inside, the silence was absolute. Travis looked at Catherine. Catherine looked at the floor. I closed the laptop. The show was over for now. They had 48 hours to dismantle their lives. I had a lunch date. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, but for the first time in years, I didn't look weighed down. I grabbed my jacket. I had a life to start living, and they had a reality to start facing. The playing field had finally been leveled. They were about to find out just how cold the world is when you don't have a checkbook to keep you warm. I watched the blue dot on my tablet screen moving rapidly east along Interstate 95. It was the GPS transponder for the Porsche 911 GT3, a car that my son Brandon believed was his birthright. He was currently driving at 90 miles an hour, weaving through traffic fueled by rage and the desperate need to find a new host organism. He was heading toward the estate of his father-in-law, a man named Franklin, who owned a chain of car dealerships and who had always looked at me with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Brandon was going to beg for a loan, or perhaps he was going to spin a story about how his cruel father had lost his mind. I took a sip of my iced tea, sitting comfortably in the corner of a quiet bistro near the library. I wasn't worried about Brandon's safety. The car was a marvel of German engineering, designed to protect the driver, even if the driver was an idiot. I was more interested in the lesson about to be delivered by the onboard computer system. You see, Brandon had always bragged to his friends that I had bought him the car for his 30th birthday. He told everyone it was a gift, a reward for his hard work at the company, even though his work mostly consisted of showing up at noon and harassing the interns. But I never buy depreciating assets. That is rule number 1 of wealth preservation. Buying a $200,000 sports car is a vanity project. Leasing it through a corporate fleet agreement with a tax-deductible structure is a business strategy. The Porsche wasn't Brandon's. It belonged to Bennett Logistics Fleet Services, and the lease agreement had a very specific clause regarding authorized operators. The vehicle was authorized for use only by employees in good standing or immediate family members domiciled with the primary officer. Since I had retired and filed for legal separation, Brandon was neither. He was now driving a stolen vehicle. I opened the fleet management app on my phone. It was the same interface used to track shipping trucks across the Midwest. I selected the unit labeled GT3 Brandon. I tapped the menu option that said Remote Immobilization. A warning box popped up asking if I was sure. I didn't hesitate. I pressed Confirm. On the GPS map, the blue dot slowed down. I imagined the scene. The engine cutting power. The power steering stiffening. The digital dashboard flashing a red warning light that said, Contact Fleet Administrator. Brandon would be forced to pull over onto the shoulder as the car entered limp mode, a safety feature that restricted speed to 5 miles per hour before shutting down completely. I switched to the audio feed from the car's cabin. The interior microphone was crystal clear. I heard the roar of the highway traffic rushing past. I heard Brandon pounding the steering wheel, screaming obscenities. He was shouting at the car as if it were a disobedient servant. Come on, you piece of junk work. He tried to restart the engine. It cranked once and died. The silence inside the cabin was heavy. Then he dialed a number. It wasn't me. It was the number that had flashed on the dashboard, the 24-hour assistance line for the leasing company. I listened as the operator answered a pleasant, professional voice. Roadside assistance, how can I help you? Brandon didn't even say hello. He started yelling. My car died. I'm on the highway. Fix it. Reset the computer. Do something. The operator asked for the VIN number or the license plate. Brandon rattled it off, his voice dripping with entitlement. Do you know who I am? He demanded. I am Brandon Bennett. This is my car. There was a pause as the operator typed. Then her voice returned, cooler this time. Sir, I see the vehicle here. It hasn't malfunctioned. A remote disable signal was sent by the account administrator. Brandon laughed a sharp, hysterical bark. That's a mistake. My father retired yesterday. He doesn't control the account anymore. Turn it back on. I have a meeting. Sir, the operator said, her patience wearing thin. The account status is listed as terminated. The vehicle has been flagged for immediate recovery. We have dispatched a flatbed to your location. Please remain with the vehicle and surrender the keys to the recovery agent. Brandon went quiet. Terminated. What do you mean, terminated? I work for the company. I'm the vice president of special projects. I almost laughed out loud in the bistro. Special projects was a title I had invented to give him health insurance. It wasn't a real job. It had no responsibilities, no reports, and crucially, no contract. Sir, the operator continued delivering the final blow. According to the file updated this morning, all employment contracts associated with the Bennett family riders have been voided due to the dissolution of the primary trust agreement. You are no longer listed as an employee. You are listed as an unauthorized driver. The police have been notified as a precaution due to the high value of the asset. Brandon dropped the phone. I heard it hit the center console. He didn't hang up. He just sat there breathing heavily. The reality was closing in on him from all sides. He didn't have a job. He didn't have a car. He didn't even have health insurance anymore. The bubble he had lived in for 32 years had popped. He had spent his entire adult life believing he was a businessman, a player in the industry. He wore the suits, he drove the car, he handed out the business cards. But it was all a costume. He was an actor on a stage I had built, and I had just turned off the lights. I watched on the GPS as the recovery vehicle approached his location. Brandon didn't wait for them. He opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder of I-95. He started walking. He was miles from the nearest exit, wearing Italian leather loafers that were never designed for asphalt. He tried to call an Uber. I could see him tapping furiously on his screen, but without a valid credit card, the app would be useless. He tried to call Megan. I couldn't hear that conversation, but I could guess how it went. Megan was probably screaming at him, asking why her own car, a Mercedes SUV leased under the same program, had just locked its doors in the driveway, trapping her purse inside. They were learning the harsh physics of their existence. They possessed nothing. They owned nothing. Everything they touched, everything they used to define their identities, was property of the Bennett Investment Trust. And the trust was a cold, unfeeling entity that recognized only one master. I closed the Fleet app. The cars were gone. The jobs were gone. The facade of their success had been stripped away, leaving them naked on the side of the road. It was a brutal lesson, but a necessary one. For years, they had looked at me with disdain, seeing only an old man who paid the bills. They had never bothered to ask how the bills were paid. They never asked about the legal structures, the tax shelters, or the liability shields. They just swiped the cards and drove the cars. Now they knew. They were guests in their own lives. And the eviction was total. I finished my iced tea and left a generous tip on the table using cash, the only currency that truly belonged to anyone. As I walked out into the afternoon sun, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't just divorcing a wife. I was liquidating a failed investment. And for the first time in 40 years, the books were finally starting to balance. They were walking now literally and metaphorically, and perhaps for the first time they would look at the ground beneath their feet and realize how hard the pavement truly is. The courtroom air was stale, recycled, and cold, exactly the way I like it. It keeps emotions low and logic high. But today, the temperature in Superior Courtroom 4B was rising rapidly, thanks to the theatrical performance of Arthur Jameson, the shark my wife had hired to skin me alive. Jameson was a man who charged $800 an hour to yell at people, and he was currently earning every penny. He paced in front of the judge's bench, gesturing wildly at me as if I were a war criminal rather than a retired accountant. "Your Honor," he boomed, his voice echoing off the mahogany panels, "this is a clear case of financial infidelity. Mr. Bennett has spent 40 years constructing a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore trusts for one purpose only: to defraud his loyal wife and children of their rightful marital assets. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars vanished into thin air overnight. This is not estate planning. This is theft." I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded calmly on the empty table in front of me. I didn't have a stack of papers. I didn't have a team of paralegals whispering in my ear. I just had Samuel Kaufman sitting next to me, looking bored, checking his watch. Across the aisle, Catherine was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, wearing a modest black suit she had probably bought yesterday to look like a grieving victim. Behind her in the gallery sat Brandon and Rachel, looking like vultures waiting for a carcass to be served. They were whispering, pointing at me, smirking. They thought Jameson was winning. They thought the judge was buying the story of the poor abandoned family. Jameson slammed his hand on the railing. We demand a full forensic audit of the Bennett Investment Trust. We demand the immediate unfreezing of all assets, and we demand punitive damages for the emotional distress inflicted upon this devoted mother and her children. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Halloway, looked over her glasses at me. Mr. Kaufman, she said, does your client have a response to these allegations of hiding assets? Kaufman didn't stand up immediately. He took a sip of water. He adjusted his cufflinks. Then he stood slowly buttoning his jacket. He didn't walk to the center of the room. He stayed by the table. Your Honor, Kaufman said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. Mr. Jameson is partially correct. There are millions of dollars that are no longer accessible to Mrs. Bennett and her children. However, the allegation that my client has hidden them is factually incorrect. Mr. Bennett hasn't hidden a dime. Catherine scoffed loud enough for the court reporter to look up. Jameson rolled his eyes. Then where is the money, Kaufman? Kaufman reached under the table and pulled out a single heavy banker's box. He placed it on the defense table with a thud. He opened the lid. The money isn't in an offshore account, Kaufman said, pulling out a thick bound volume. It isn't in a shell company. It is right here in the receipts. He walked up to the bench and handed the volume to the judge. He handed a copy to Jameson. Jameson snatched it, looking confused. What is this? Jameson asked. That Kaufman said is a 10-year forensic accounting of the discretionary spending of the Bennett family. You see, Your Honor, my client is a man of meticulous records. Every swipe of a credit card, every wire transfer, every cash withdrawal made by his wife and children since 2014 has been cataloged, categorized, and archived. I watched Catherine. She stopped dabbing her eyes. She leaned forward, trying to see the book. Kaufman turned to the courtroom. The plaintiffs claim they have been cut off from their fair share. The defense argues that they have already consumed their share. In fact, they have consumed it with a gluttony that borders on the pathological. Let us look at Exhibit A. A Kaufman said, his voice sharpening. Catherine Bennett. Over the last decade, Mrs. Bennett has charged exactly $3.2 million to the trust's primary credit lines. The number hung in the air. Jameson froze. Catherine went pale and went, 3.2 million, the judge repeated, looking at the ledger. On what exactly? Kaufman didn't need to look at the book. He had memorized it. Couture clothing, Your Honor, 1.4 million. Jewelry, 800,000. Cosmetic procedures, 400,000. And my personal favorite, a line item for spiritual consulting, which appears to be a psychic in Sedona who charges $5,000 a month to cleanse Mrs. Bennett's aura. There was a ripple of laughter in the back of the courtroom. Catherine turned red. That is my money, she hissed. I am his wife. I have a right to maintain my lifestyle. Kaufman ignored her. He turned a page. Exhibit B, Brandon Bennett, the 32-year-old son who claims to be a venture capitalist. I looked back at Brandon. He was shrinking in his seat. He knew what was coming. According to these records, Kaufman continued, the trust has financed 6 separate business ventures for Mr. Brandon Bennett. A craft brewery in 2016. Liquidation loss, $200,000. A cryptocurrency arbitrage firm in 2018. Loss $400,000. A luxury sneaker resale app in 2020. Loss $500,000. Kaufman looked at Brandon directly. Total capital destroyed by Mr. Brandon Bennett in failed vanity projects, $1.5 million. This does not include the $300,000 spent on travel and entertainment to promote these businesses which produced zero revenue. Brandon stood up. That was seed capital, he shouted, his voice cracking. You can't count that against me. That was investment. It was a loan, Kaufman corrected him coldly. A loan against his future inheritance. The trust bylaws are very specific. Capital provided to beneficiaries for business ventures is structured as a callable debt obligation. Jameson was flipping through the pages frantically. He was realizing that his client had lied to him. He had been told I was a miser who gave them nothing. The book in his hands proved I was a fountain of cash that they had drained dry. And finally, Kaufman said, Exhibit C, Rachel Bennett, the influencer. Rachel pulled her sunglasses down her nose, glaring at Kaufman. $500,000 in credit card debt, Kaufman stated, mostly travel hotels and photographers. But the most interesting part. Your Honor is that while Miss Bennett claims to make money from her social media career, the tax returns included in the appendix show a net income of less than $4,000 a year. The trust has been subsidizing her entire existence to the tune of $10,000 a month. Kaufman closed the book. He walked back to our table and stood next to me. Your Honor, the plaintiffs are asking where the money went. It went to Paris. It went to Milan. It went to bad crypto deals and psychic readings. My client Lawrence Bennett didn't hide the assets. He watched them eat the assets. The judge looked at Jameson. Mr. Jameson, do you have a response to these figures? Jameson was sweating. He loosened his tie. Your Honor, even if these figures are accurate, this was marital spending. It was a lifestyle established during the marriage. And that marriage ended the moment Mrs. Bennett filed the paperwork. Kaufman interrupted. And here is the final nail in the coffin. Kaufman pulled one last document from the box. This is the master charter of the Bennett Investment Trust, established by Lawrence Bennett's father. Clause 4, Section 9. The recoupment clause. I stood up then. It was time for me to speak. I didn't need a microphone. My voice was trained in boardrooms where silence was a weapon. Your Honor, I said, looking at the judge. My father was a man who believed in consequences. He wrote that clause to ensure that the family fortune would never be squandered by incompetence or greed. I turned to look at Catherine, then at Brandon and Rachel. The clause states that in the event of a divorce initiated by a beneficiary's spouse, any funds spent by the spouse and children in excess of the standard cost of living index are retroactively reclassified as personal debt to the trust. Catherine gasped. She understood. She finally understood. I am not hiding assets, I said to the silent courtroom. I am calling in the loan. They don't just have nothing, Your Honor. They owe the trust $5.2 million. And since I am the sole trustee, I am initiating collection proceedings effective immediately. The room erupted. Catherine started screaming at Jameson, telling him to do something. Brandon was trying to leave the courtroom, but the bailiff blocked the aisle. Rachel was crying, saying she couldn't be in debt. The judge banged her gavel. Order, she shouted. Order in this court. She looked at the ledger again. She looked at me. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Respect. Mr. Bennett, she said, this court finds the documentation provided by the defense to be substantial. The motion to freeze Mr. Bennett's personal accounts is denied. The motion for a forensic audit is denied as the defense has already provided one. She turned to Jameson. Counselor, I suggest you advise your clients to find a way to settle their debts with the trust before this goes to bankruptcy court. Case dismissed. Jameson slammed his briefcase shut and glared at Catherine. You told me he was hiding money, he hissed. You didn't tell me you spent $5 million. I'm done. Find another lawyer. He stormed out, leaving them alone. I walked past my family. Catherine grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my suit jacket. Larry, she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. You can't do this. We don't have $5 million. You know we don't. I gently removed her hand from my arm. I know, Catherine, I said. That's why you need to get a job. The trust accepts monthly payments, but don't be late. The interest rate is prime plus 4%. I walked out of the courtroom, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own greed. They had come looking for a payout. They left with a bill. And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel the weight of their expectations on my shoulders. I felt only the lightness of the truth. They had spent their future. Now they had to pay for their past. The downfall of the Bennett dynasty did not happen in a marble foyer or a corporate boardroom. It happened in the cramped beige interior of the Starlight Motel on the outskirts of town, a place where the sheets smell of bleach and regret. My private investigator sent me the audio files from the listening device Catherine had unknowingly carried in her purse, a purse she was now clutching like a lifeline because it was the only designer item she had left. They had been evicted from the estate exactly 48 hours after the sheriff arrived. They had packed their lives into plastic garbage bags because they couldn't afford moving boxes. Now crammed into 2 adjoining rooms with thin walls, the pressure cooker finally exploded. I sat in my quiet apartment, listening to the recording, sipping a glass of water, witnessing the inevitable cannibalization of a family built on greed. It started with Travis, my son-in-law, the mediocre real estate agent who had spent 5 years treating me like his personal bank teller. He had been on his phone for hours trying to find a loophole, trying to find a hidden account, trying to find anything that would salvage his financial future. But he found nothing. What he found instead was the truth about his wife. I heard his voice on the recording, shrill and panicked. He was screaming at Rachel. He asked her about the trust fund. He asked her about the inheritance she had promised him existed. Rachel was sobbing. She admitted she had lied. She admitted she had told him there were millions in her name just to get him to propose. She admitted that her entire net worth was tied to a credit card that was now cut in half on a motel nightstand. The sound of a suitcase zipper cut through the argument. Travis wasn't staying to work it out. He wasn't staying for better or for worse. He was staying for richer, and now that we were at poorer, he was checking out. I heard him tell Rachel that he was filing for an annulment based on fraud. He called her a parasite. He told her she was exactly like her mother. Then the door slammed. Rachel wailed. It was the sound of a woman realizing that her beauty and her followers meant nothing when the rent was due. But while Rachel's life was imploding in room 102, a far more dangerous plan was hatching in room 104. Brandon and Megan were sitting on the edge of a stained mattress, staring at a vending machine dinner they couldn't stomach. Megan was the catalyst. She was a woman who had never worked a day in her life. A woman who believed the world owed her a living simply for existing. I heard her voice low and venomous. She was whispering to Brandon. She told him that I was evil. She told him that I had stolen their birthright. She twisted the reality until Brandon was the victim of a grand theft, not the beneficiary of decades of generosity. Then she pitched her idea. She reminded Brandon about the overflow warehouse at Bennett Logistics. It was a facility I had managed for 20 years. It housed high-value electronics and luxury goods before distribution. Megan told him that since his last name was Bennett, those goods belonged to him. She told him to go there. She told him to take a truckload. She said they could fence the goods in the city and get enough cash to hire a real lawyer, one who could fight the trust. Brandon hesitated. I heard the fear in his voice. He said he didn't have a key. He said security was tight. Megan mocked him. She questioned his manhood. She asked him if he was going to let his father starve them to death. She manipulated him with the skill of a surgeon, cutting away his conscience until only his desperation remained. Around 2:00 a.m., my phone alerted me. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from the security grid at the Bennett Logistics warehouse. Perimeter breach. Sector 4. I opened the camera feed. The video was grainy night vision, but the figure was unmistakable. It was Brandon. He was wearing a dark hoodie, trying to pry open a side door with a crowbar. He looked terrified. He looked clumsy. He was trying to break into a fortress I had spent 40 years fortifying. He managed to pop the lock on an old service entrance. He slipped inside. I switched cameras. He was walking down the aisles, shining a flashlight on pallets of iPads and designer watches. He grabbed a box, tearing it open. He started stuffing electronics into a duffel bag. He didn't know that the moment he breached the perimeter, the silent alarm had tripped. He didn't know that the warehouse was equipped with a pressure-sensitive floor system that tracked his every movement. And he certainly didn't know that the security contract I had signed years ago guaranteed a police response time of under 4 minutes. I watched the screen as the blue and red lights flashed silently against the warehouse windows. Brandon didn't notice until it was too late. He turned a corner carrying a bag full of stolen property and walked straight into a wall of tactical lights. Police, get on the ground. I saw my son drop the bag. I saw him raise his hands. I saw him shoved against the concrete floor, his face pressed into the dust. He was crying. He was screaming that his name was Bennett, that he owned the place. The officer didn't care. He cuffed him. He read him his rights. They dragged him out to the cruiser, a thief caught in the act, stealing from the legacy he was too lazy to build. My phone rang at 3:30 a.m. It was Catherine. I let it ring 3 times before answering. I was sitting in my leather chair looking out at the city skyline, feeling the weight of the night. "Hello, Catherine," I said. She didn't say hello. She screamed. Her voice was raw, hysterical, the sound of a woman who had lost control of her reality. "You monster!" she shrieked. "You let them arrest him. You knew. You saw it, and you did nothing." I stayed silent. I let her pour her venom into the receiver. "Megan called me," she sobbed. "She said Brandon is in the central lockup. They charged him with grand larceny and breaking and entering. He faces 5 years, Lawrence, 5 years. He is your son. How could you let this happen? You have the power to stop it. You could have called security. You could have dropped the charges." I took a slow breath. The entitlement was breathtaking. Even now, after everything, she believed it was my duty to cushion their falls. She believed that my role was to be the eternal safety net, catching them no matter how deliberately they jumped. "Catherine," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I didn't make him break into a warehouse. I didn't hand him a crowbar. I didn't tell him to steal. He was desperate," she yelled. "He was hungry. You cut us off. You starved us. This is your fault." "No," I corrected her. "This is the result of 30 years of never hearing the word no. Brandon is 32 years old. He is a man. Men make choices. And tonight, he chose to become a criminal." "Fix it," she demanded, reverting to the tone she used when ordering a servant. "Call the police chief. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him Brandon had permission. Get him out, Lawrence, or I swear to God I will." "You will what?" I interrupted. "You will divorce me. You will take my house. You will turn my children against me. You have already fired every bullet in your gun, Catherine. You are clicking on an empty chamber." There was silence on the line. Heavy breathing, silence. "You wanted freedom," I said, leaning forward, speaking the words that I had held back for a lifetime. "You stood on that stage and announced to the world that you were done with me. You wanted to be independent. You wanted to be liberated from my control." I paused to let the words sink in. "Well, Catherine, this is it. This is what freedom looks like. Freedom is not just doing whatever you want. Freedom includes the liberty to fail. It includes the obligation to face the consequences of your own stupidity. Brandon is free now. He is free to navigate the legal system. He is free to find a public defender. And you are free to figure out how to post bail without a credit card." "But he's your son," she whispered, her voice breaking into a whimper. "He was my son when I paid for his college," I said. "He was my son when I bought him his first suit. He was my son when I offered him a job he didn't show up for. Tonight, he isn't my son. Tonight, he is a burglar who broke into a corporate facility owned by the trust. and the trust presses charges. I hung up the phone. I didn't block the number. I wanted her to call back. I wanted her to realize that the silence on my end was a choice, not an error. I looked at the screen where the police cruiser was driving away with Brandon in the back seat. It was a tragedy, yes. But it was a tragedy they had written, directed, and starred in. I was just the audience. And for the first time, I wasn't going to rush the stage to stop the play. I was going to let the final act play out all the way to the curtain call. The night was quiet again. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hand was steady. My conscience was clear. They had wanted a life without Lawrence Bennett. They had wanted the world without my rules, without my oversight. Now they had it. They had a cold motel room, a broken marriage, a son in jail, and a phone that no longer summoned a savior. They were finally completely on their own. And the sun was about to rise on a very different kind of day. The Oakwood Country Club was a fortress of old money and new gossip, a place where reputations were currency and exclusion was a blood sport. For 30 years, I had walked these manicured grounds as a shadow. I was Catherine's husband, the wallet with legs, the man who held her purse while she drank vodka tonics with women who despised her. To the staff, I was invisible. To the members, I was a utility bill, necessary but boring. They tolerated me because I paid the dues, but they never respected me because Catherine made sure everyone knew who the social captain of the Bennett ship was. But today, I did not walk in through the side entrance. I drove my black Lincoln right up to the portico. The valet, a young man named Kevin, who had parked my Ford hundreds of times without making eye contact, scrambled to open my door. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had. Wealth has a gravity that pulls people in, and the sudden liquidation of the Bennett family assets had created a black hole that everyone was staring at. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett," Kevin stammered. Or should I say, Mr. Chairman. I handed him a $100 bill. "Chairman sounds fine, Kevin. Keep it close." I walked into the grand ballroom, the same room where Catherine had planned her 50th birthday party, a gala that had cost me 6 figures, and where I wasn't even allowed to give a toast. Today, the room was set for the annual charity gala, the highlight of the social season. This was the event Catherine lived for. It was the night she would wear a gown she couldn't afford, drink champagne she didn't pay for, and hold court with the elite of Connecticut society. But Catherine wasn't here. Her name had been scrubbed from the guest list at 9:00 a.m. that morning. The bylaws of the club were very specific regarding membership. It was tied to the primary account holder, since I had removed her as an authorized user, and since her personal check for the auxiliary dues had bounced 3 days ago, she was no longer a member in good standing. She was persona non grata. I adjusted my tuxedo cuffs and stepped into the room. The conversation didn't stop, but it shifted. Heads turned. I saw the eyes of Catherine circle the viper pit she called her best friends. There was Eleanor Vance, a woman who had once told Catherine in front of me that I lacked ambition. There was Margaret Thorne, who had encouraged Catherine to leave me years ago. They were huddled together, holding their crystal flutes, whispering. They expected to see a broken man. They expected a man mourning the loss of his family, a man shamed by the public divorce. Instead, they saw a man who looked 10 years younger. They saw a man wearing a bespoke tuxedo that fit perfectly, a man who walked with the easy confidence of someone who holds the deed to the building. Eleanor was the first to approach. She was a predator, and she sensed a shift in the wind. Lawrence, she cooed, reaching out a hand adorned with diamonds that were likely leased. We were so shocked to hear about the restructuring. Is Catherine all right? We haven't heard from her in days. I took her hand, but I didn't kiss it. I held it for a second too long, forcing her to look at me. Catherine is finding her own path, Eleanor. I said, my voice projecting just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. She always wanted independence. I simply gave her the opportunity to experience it fully. Eleanor blinked. But the house We heard the sheriff was involved. It all sounds so messy. It was a correction, Eleanor, I replied. A necessary market correction. Speaking of which, I believe the auction is about to start. I walked away from her, leaving her standing there, confused and unsettled. She pulled out her phone immediately. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was texting Catherine. She was typing him. He is here. He looks rich. He doesn't look sad. I took my seat at the head table. The club president, a man named Sterling, tapped his glass. The room went quiet. He introduced me not as the boring accountant, but as the club's new honorary chairman of the philanthropic board, a title I had acquired with a substantial donation earlier that week. I stood up and walked to the podium. The spotlight hit me. I looked out at the sea of faces, the people who had ignored me for decades. I saw the greed in their eyes. They didn't care about Catherine. They cared about the winner. And in the brutal calculus of their world, I had won. Thank you, everyone, I said into the microphone. For years, my family has enjoyed the hospitality of this club. Tonight, I wanted to give something back. I reached into my jacket pocket. I didn't pull out a speech. I pulled out a check. A large, oversized presentation check was brought out from behind the curtain, held by two assistants. As many of you know, I have recently entered a new phase of life, I continued. My retirement has been eventful. During the legal proceedings of the last week, my former attorneys estimated a certain sum of money that would have been allocated for a divorce settlement, a sum that was demanded to maintain a lifestyle that frankly no longer exists. I paused. I saw Eleanor holding her phone up, recording. Good. I wanted Catherine to see this in high definition. Since that settlement is no longer legally required due to the activation of the trust's preservation clauses, I found myself with a surplus of liquidity. Rather than letting it sit in a bank, I decided to invest it in a cause that appreciates value. I gestured to the check. The number was written in bold black ink, $5 million. Tonight, the Bennett Investment Trust is donating $5 million to the Urban Youth Entrepreneurship Program. This money will help young people build their own businesses from the ground up so they never have to rely on anyone else to survive. The room gasped. $5 million. It was an astronomical sum even for this crowd. It was exactly the amount Jameson had demanded in his opening salvo for Catherine's alimony and lump sum payment. I looked directly at the camera lens of the videographer documenting the event. It is my hope, I said, my voice hardening slightly, that this money teaches the next generation the value of earning their keep. Because as I have recently learned, giving people money they didn't earn doesn't help them, it destroys them. The applause was thunderous. It was a standing ovation. People were cheering, whistling, clapping until their hands hurt. Eleanor Vance was clapping the hardest, a fake smile plastered on her face while her eyes darted around in panic. She knew. They all knew. I had just taken the money that Catherine believed was her salvation, the money she thought she was entitled to for tolerating me, and I had given it away to strangers. I had burned her golden parachute on live television. I walked off the stage, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. I felt a vibration in my pocket. I checked my burner phone. It was a notification from my security software. A login attempt on my old social media account. Location, the Starlight Motel. Catherine was watching. She was sitting in that dingy room, probably huddled around a phone with Rachel and Travis watching the live stream. She was watching her friends applaud me. She was watching her social standing evaporate. In this world, you are only as good as your last donation. And she had zero. She wasn't just broke now. She was irrelevant. I had stripped her of the one thing she valued more than money, her status. She couldn't show her face in this club ever again. Not because she couldn't pay the dues, but because she was now the punchline of the joke. She was the woman who walked away from $5 million and got nothing but an eviction notice. I signaled the waiter for a drink, a Scotch neat. I took a sip and looked around the room. The air tasted different here. It tasted clean. I realized then that I wasn't just punishing them. I was erasing them. I was rewriting the history of Lawrence Bennett, and in this new version, they were just footnotes. The party continued into the night, but for Catherine Bennett sitting in the dark 2 miles away, the lights had gone out forever. 6 months is a long time in the world of high finance, but it is an eternity in the world of minimum wage labor. I sat in my penthouse office overlooking the gray waters of Lake Michigan, a view that cost more than the entire Bennett estate I had liquidated watching a video file sent by my private investigator. The subject of the surveillance was a woman standing behind Register 4 at a Walmart supercenter on the edge of town. She was wearing a blue vest that was 2 sizes too big. Her hair, once dyed a perfect honey blonde at $300 a session, was now showing inch-long roots of steel gray. She was scanning a 50-pound bag of dog food. It was Catherine, my wife. The woman who had thrown a divorce petition onto a cake was now asking customers if they had found everything they were looking for. The humiliation was absolute. I zoomed in on her hands. The diamond rings were gone, sold months ago to pay for a lawyer who eventually fired her. Her nails were short and unpolished. She looked tired. She looked defeated. But mostly, she looked angry. She scanned the items with a mechanical aggression, slamming cans of soup onto the belt. I watched as a woman approached the register. I recognized her immediately. It was Margaret Thorne, one of Catherine's old tennis partners from the club. Margaret was buying a cart full of party supplies, expensive wines, and cheeses. Catherine froze. She tried to look away. She tried to hide behind the register screen, but there was nowhere to go. Margaret looked up. She paused. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how Catherine was doing. She simply handed Catherine a coupon and waited for the discount. Catherine took it, her hand trembling. She scanned it. She bagged the wine. She handed Margaret the receipt. Margaret walked away without a word, leaving Catherine standing there, stripped of the last shred of her social armor. I closed the video file. It wasn't cruelty that made me watch. It was due diligence. I needed to know if the lesson had been learned. I opened the next file. It was a series of photographs taken outside a pawn shop in the city. The subject was Rachel, my daughter, the influencer, who used to post unboxing videos of luxury goods, was now doing the boxing. She was standing at the counter arguing with a man behind bulletproof glass. On the counter sat a Hermès Birkin bag, a graduation gift I had purchased for $12,000. The audio file attached to the photos was grainy but audible. Rachel was pleading. She was telling the pawnbroker that the bag was an investment piece, that it appreciated in value. The broker wasn't interested in fashion economics. He offered her $800. Rachel screamed. She said it was robbery. She grabbed the bag and stormed out, only to stop on the sidewalk, check her phone, and walk back in. She took the $800. I checked the background report. Rachel had been evicted from 3 apartments in 6 months. She was currently subletting a room in a basement apartment, sharing a bathroom with 3 strangers. Her social media channels were dead. She had tried to pivot to a pity narrative, posting videos about her cruel father, but the internet is a fickle beast. The commenters didn't feel sorry for a rich girl who lost her allowance. They mocked her. They told her to get a job. She stopped posting when she had to sell her iPhone to pay a utility bill. Then there was Brandon. My son had been released from county jail 3 weeks ago. He had served his time for the breaking and entering charge, pleading down to a misdemeanor to avoid prison, but the felony theft charge remained on his record. I opened his file. It contained a stack of rejection letters. Brandon had applied to banks, hedge funds, and consulting firms, relying on the Bennett name to open doors. But the Bennett name was now associated with a ruthless liquidation and a desperate burglary. No one would hire him. I saw a video of him sitting in a park eating a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He looked older. The soft arrogance of his youth had hardened into a bitter scowl. He was wearing work boots and jeans stained with paint. He had finally found work as a day laborer on a construction crew, a job he got because they paid cash and didn't ask questions. My son, who had once complained that his office chair wasn't ergonomic enough, was now hauling sheetrock up 4 flights of stairs for $12 an hour. That evening, the three of them converged. They weren't meeting at a country club or a 5-star restaurant. They were meeting in the cramped living room of the small 2-bedroom apartment Catherine had managed to rent with her Walmart wages and a cosigner I didn't recognize. I tapped into the audio feed from the listening device my investigator had planted behind the radiator. The mood was grim. They were eating takeout pizza, the kind that comes in a cardboard box, grease soaking through the bottom. "This isn't working," Catherine said, her voice raspy from smoking cheap cigarettes. "I can't do the standing anymore. My veins are popping." And seeing Margaret today, she looked at me like I was the help. "I am the help," Brandon snapped. "I spent 8 hours sanding a floor today. My hands are bleeding, and the foreman called me idiot all day. I have a degree, Mom. I have a degree in philosophy." Rachel was scrolling on a cheap, prepaid phone. "Travis blocked me," she said. "He's dating a 22-year-old real estate agent. He says our annulment went through." "I have nothing, Mom. I sold the Birkin. I have 1 pair of Louboutins left and the heel is broken." They sat in silence, chewing the cardboard pizza. They were miserable. They were broken. But then the conversation shifted. It didn't shift toward remorse. It didn't shift toward self-reflection. It shifted toward strategy. "He has to be lonely," Catherine said quietly. "Think about it. He's 67 years old. He's living in some apartment in the city, all by himself. He doesn't have anyone. He spent 40 years with us. You don't just turn that off." "He hates us," Brandon said, wiping his mouth. "He put me in jail, Mom. He pressed charges. He was trying to teach you a lesson." Catherine countered, her voice gaining strength. "That's what he does. He's a teacher. He wants to be the patriarch, the wise old man who guides the wayward children. He's waiting for us to come back. He's waiting for us to beg." Rachel looked up. "You think so? You think if we apologize, he'll open the trust back up?" "I know him," Catherine said. "He's proud. But he's also sentimental. He kept every drawing you ever made, Brandon. He kept every report card. He wants his family back. He just wants to win. If we let him win, if we go there and get on our knees and tell him he was right about everything, he will crack. He needs to feel like the savior." Brandon looked skeptical. "And what if he doesn't crack? What if he just laughs at us? Then we have nothing to lose," Catherine said. "But if he does, imagine it. The house, the cars, the black card. We just have to swallow our pride for one afternoon. We go there. We cry. We tell him we miss him. We tell him we've learned the value of $1. We play the part." Rachel nodded slowly. "I can cry," she said. "I can do the prodigal daughter thing. I'll wear something modest. No makeup. And I'll tell him the construction job changed me," Brandon added. "I'll tell him I understand hard work now. He loves that grit stuff." Catherine smiled. It was a ghost of her old smile, the predator reawakening. "We go tomorrow," she said. "I found his address. He's in a building by the lake. We go there, and we don't leave until he signs a check. We just have to stroke his ego. We have to make him believe we've changed." I listened to them plotting. They were constructing a script based on a version of me that no longer existed. They thought I was the same man they had walked all over for decades. They thought my cutting them off was a tantrum, a temporary punishment that could be ended with a few magic words. They didn't understand that I hadn't punished them, I had fired them. They thought they were dealing with a father and a husband. They were dealing with the chairman of the board. And when you approach the chairman with a fraudulent proposal, you don't get funding. You get security called on you. I turned off the audio feed. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights reflecting on the dark water. They were coming. They were bringing their lies and their fake tears and their rehearsed speeches. They thought they were going to hack the system. I picked up my phone and dialed Kaufman. "Sam," I said, "prepare the paperwork." "What paperwork?" Kaufman asked, his voice sleepy. "The restraining orders," said. "The employment contracts. The standard entry-level agreements. Liability waivers. Drug testing consent forms. And bring 3 uniforms, sizes medium large and extra large." Kaufman paused. "You're actually going to do it?" "They want back in Sam," I said. "They want to be part of the Bennett legacy. I'm going to give them exactly what they asked for. They think they're coming to a family reunion. They're coming to a job interview." I hung up. I went to bed and slept soundly. The trap was set. They were walking right into the only thing they feared more than poverty: work. The elevator that services the penthouse of the Pinnacle does not have buttons. It has a biometric scanner, and it moves with the silence of a predator stalking its prey. I stood in the center of my foyer waiting for the doors to slide open. I had leaked my address to a mutual acquaintance, a woman who could never keep a secret, knowing it would reach Catherine within the hour. They expected to find me in a sad assisted living facility, perhaps a 1-bedroom apartment with beige walls and the smell of boiled cabbage. They expected to find a broken man staring at a television set, waiting to die. When the polished steel doors parted, they did not step into a nursing home. They stepped onto Italian marble imported from a quarry in Carrara. They stepped into a space with 20-foot ceilings and a panoramic view of Lake Michigan that stretched all the way to the horizon. The late afternoon sun flooded the apartment, turning the dust motes into gold. I watched them freeze. It was a tableau of calculated humility. Catherine was wearing a gray wool coat that looked 3 sizes too big, a garment she had likely pulled from the back of a closet she hadn't opened since the 90s. She wore no jewelry, not even a watch. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing the age she had spent a fortune trying to hide. Behind her stood Brandon and Rachel. They were dressed in what I can only describe as poverty cosplay. Brandon wore a flannel shirt and work boots that looked scuffed, not from labor, but from sandpaper. Rachel wore a simple cotton dress and flat shoes, her hair tied back in a severe bun. They looked like refugees from a period drama. They had come dressed for a funeral, the funeral of my pride. Catherine was the first to recover. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the grand piano, the abstract sculptures, the sheer expanse of the square footage. I could see the calculator running behind her eyes. She was doing the math. She was realizing that while she was scanning dog food, I was living in a fortress of solitude that cost more per month than she used to spend in a year. "Lawrence," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. "We didn't know. We thought you were suffering." I stood with my hands clasped behind my back, wearing a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply observed. "Hello, Catherine," I said. "I see you found the place." She took a step forward, her hands reaching out as if to touch a holy relic. "We came because we couldn't sleep," she said. "The guilt, Lawrence. It has been eating us alive. We realized how wrong we were. We realized that money is poison." It was a good line. I wondered if she had written it herself, or if she had lifted it from a daytime soap opera. Brandon stepped up next to her. He dropped to his knees. He actually dropped to his knees on the marble floor. "Dad." He choked out, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I was an idiot. I was blind. That job, the construction job, it taught me. It broke me down, Dad. I know what it means to work now. I know what you tried to teach me. I just want my father back. Rachel joined him, kneeling beside her brother. She kept her head down, playing the part of the submissive, repentant daughter. I miss you, Daddy, she sobbed. I don't care about the bags. I don't care about the followers. I just want to sit and have dinner with you again. I want us to be a family. I looked at them. 3 actors on a stage performing for an audience of 1. If I hadn't listened to their conversation the night before, I might have been moved. I might have believed that the hardship had cracked their shells and let some light in. But I knew better. I knew this was a heist. They weren't here for forgiveness. They were here for the combination to the safe. I unclasped my hands and gestured toward the sunken living room, where a fire was crackling in the modern gas fireplace. Stand up, I said, my voice neutral. You are making a scene and I just had the floors polished. Come in. Sit down. They scrambled to their feet, hope flaring in their eyes like a match in a dark room. They thought the door was opening. They thought I was buying the act. They walked into the living room, treading softly, as if afraid to wake a sleeping beast. They sat on the edge of the sprawling white leather sofa, huddled together, a united front of misery. I walked to the sidebar and poured a pitcher of water. I brought 4 glasses. I placed them on the coffee table. In the center of the table, sitting alone on the glass surface, was a thick navy blue legal folder. It was bound with a gold elastic cord. The label on the front was typed in bold serif font. Bennett Investment Trust, Reorganization and Reinstatement Protocol. I saw Catherine's eyes lock onto the folder. She stopped breathing for a second. Her gaze was hungry, desperate. She nudged Brandon with her elbow. He looked down. Rachel looked down. The folder was a magnet pulling all their attention. To them, that folder wasn't paper. It was a time machine. It was a ticket back to the country club, back to the Porsche, back to the life where consequences were things that happened to other people. I sat in the armchair opposite them. I crossed my legs. I took a sip of water. You say you have learned, I said, looking at Brandon. Tell me, what have you learned? Brandon cleared his throat. He sat up straighter. I learned that nothing is given, Dad. I learned that when you sweat for $1, it feels different. I learned that respect is earned. And you, Rachel, I asked. I learned that appearances are a trap, she said, wiping a tear. I was chasing likes from strangers when I should have been valuing the people who actually loved me. And Catherine, I said, turning to the architect of my destruction. She looked at me, her eyes swimming with tears that were almost impressive in their volume. I learned that a marriage isn't a contract, Lawrence. It is a partnership. And I broke that partnership. I listened to bad advice. I let my ego drive the car. I am willing to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. I will sign a post-nup. I will live in a studio. I just want to be your wife again. It was a masterclass in manipulation. If I hadn't known she called me a miser yesterday, I would have applauded. I leaned forward and placed my hand on the blue folder. The room went silent. You could hear the wind howling outside the glass, but inside it was a vacuum. I am glad to hear that I said tapping the cover of the dossier, because I have been doing a lot of thinking too. Living here in this silence, it gives a man perspective. I realized that perhaps I was too harsh. Perhaps the sudden shock was too much trauma for a family to bear. Catherine let out a sob of relief. Oh, Lawrence, she breathed. I continued, my hand still resting on the folder. I realized that simply cutting you off was not the solution. It didn't solve the underlying problem. You needed structure. You needed a path back. Yes, Brandon said eagerly. A path. That's all we want. A chance to prove ourselves. I picked up the folder. I felt the weight of it. My lawyers advised against this, I lied. Kaufman told me I was making a mistake. He told me you would never change. But I told him that blood is thicker than water. I told him that everyone deserves a second chance if they are willing to do the work. Rachel nodded vigorously. We are Daddy. We are willing to do anything. I opened the folder. Inside were 3 distinct stacks of paper, crisp and white. This document, I said, represents a new beginning. It is a reintegration plan. It outlines a way for you to be part of the Bennett legacy again. It provides financial security. It provides purpose. And most importantly, it restores the family connection. Catherine was practically vibrating. She was already mentally redecorating the penthouse. She was imagining the look on Margaret Thorne's face when she walked back into the club with a diamond bigger than the last one. I separated the stacks of paper. I slid one toward Catherine, one toward Brandon, and one toward Rachel. But I said, my voice dropping an octave, there are conditions. This is not a handout. This is an agreement. You said you wanted to earn your way back. You said you understood the value of work. Yes, yes, Catherine said, reaching for the paper. Anything, Lawrence. Then sign, I said. They didn't read it. They didn't even look at the headers. They saw the Bennett Trust logo at the top, and they grabbed the pens I had placed on the table. They signed their names with a speed that spoke of desperation. They signed the bottom of the first page. They flipped and signed the second. I watched them. I watched the greed override their caution. I watched them sign away their freedom, thinking they were signing a receipt for a winning lottery ticket. When they were finished, Catherine handed the papers back to me with a smile that was almost genuine, because she truly believed she had won. Thank you, Lawrence, she said. You won't regret this. I took the papers. I checked the signatures. They were valid, binding, irrevocable. I smiled, a cold, sharp smile that finally reached my eyes. No, Catherine, I said, standing up and closing the folder. I don't think I will. I walked to the intercom on the wall and pressed a button. Kaufman, bring the uniforms. The door to the study opened. Samuel Kaufman walked in carrying 3 bundles of gray fabric wrapped in plastic. He placed them on the coffee table next to the empty water glasses. Uniforms, Brandon asked, his smile faltering. I picked up the document Catherine had just signed. Welcome back to the company, I said. You just signed standard employment contracts for the Bennett Logistics Distribution Center. Entry level. I pointed to the pile of clothes. Brandon, you signed on as a level 1 material handler. That means loading trucks. Catherine, you are part of the sanitation and maintenance crew. Night shift. And Rachel, you are in inventory data entry in the sub-basement. No phones allowed. Catherine stood up, her face turning purple. What is this? Is this a joke? I held up the contract. Clause 1. Employment is at will, but acceptance of this position is a prerequisite for any future consideration regarding trust beneficiary status. You said you wanted to work, Catherine. You said you wanted to earn it. The pay is minimum wage, but the benefits package is excellent after 90 days. You can't be serious, she screamed. I am not a janitor. You are now, I said. Or you can leave. But if you walk out that door, you violate the contract you just signed, and the door to this family closes forever. This is the offer. Take it or leave it. They looked at the uniforms. They looked at the luxury apartment. They looked at me. They realized the trap had snapped shut. They had begged for a chance. I gave them a job. And now they had to decide how much their pride was really worth. The silence in the penthouse was broken only by the rustling of fabric as Brandon picked up the gray shirt with the name patch that read trainee. He held it like it was a contaminated object, his fingers trembling. The reality of what they had just signed was settling in heavy and suffocating. They had traded their dignity for a paycheck, but they hadn't realized the paycheck came with calluses. I watched them from my armchair, my expression unreadable. I had spent 40 years building a logistics empire from the ground up. I had started on a loading dock in 1984, sweeping floors and organizing manifests, before I ever saw a balance sheet. I knew the value of $1 because I had bled for the first 1,000. My family, however, treated money like magic. To them, it was something that appeared in an account, not something generated by labor. "You want my money," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. "You want the Bennett lifestyle. You want the security. Fine. I am giving it to you. But you are going to get it the exact same way I did. This is the only one I earned it for 40 years. Work. You start at the bottom, minimum wage. No favors, no nepotism. If you are late, you are fired. If you steal, you are arrested. If you complain, you are gone." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Megan Brandon's wife stormed in. She had been waiting in the lobby, refusing to kneel with the others, probably expecting Brandon to come down with a check. She saw the uniforms. She saw Brandon holding the work boots. She saw the tears on Rachel's face. "What is this?" Megan shrieked, her voice shrill and grating. "Where is the money, Brandon? You said he was going to reinstate the trust fund. Why are you holding a janitor's uniform?" Brandon looked at his wife. He looked tired. He looked hungry. "We have jobs, Megan," he whispered. "Dad gave us jobs. We can earn our way back." "Jobs." Megan laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the marble walls. "You think I married you to date a warehouse loader? You think I stuck around through the eviction and the motel to watch you sweep floors? You are pathetic, Brandon. You are a loser. And your father is a psycho." She turned to me, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You can keep your minimum wage, old man. I am not a servant. I am leaving. And Brandon, if you sign that paper, don't bother coming back to the motel. We are done." She turned on her heel and marched back into the elevator. The doors closed, sealing her out of our lives. Brandon watched her go. He didn't chase her. He didn't scream. He just slumped his shoulders, the weight of his poor choices finally crushing him completely. He had lost his car, his house, his pride, and now his wife. He was stripped bare. He looked at the pen on the table. He looked at the W-4 tax form and the liability waiver for the loading dock position. His stomach growled. It was a loud, guttural sound that betrayed the reality of their situation. They hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. The pizza from the night before had been split 4 ways. I picked up the pen and held it out to him. "Sign, Brandon," I said softly, "or go hungry. It is a simple choice. The cafeteria at the warehouse serves hot meals. Employee discount." Brandon took the pen. His hand was shaking, but he pressed the tip to the paper. He signed. He accepted the role of material handler level 1. He accepted the hard hat and the steel-toed boots. He accepted that he was no longer a prince but a worker. Rachel was next. She looked at the data entry form. "No phones allowed on the floor," she whispered at reading the fine print. "Daddy, I can't. My followers. Your followers aren't going to pay your rent." "Rachel," I said, "the warehouse pays $15 an hour. That is enough for a room and food. Sign the paper." She picked up the pen. She cried as she did it, big, silent tears that ruined her simple dress. She signed her name. She signed away her delusions of grandeur and accepted a life of data entry in a windowless room. She was saving herself, but she was killing her ego. Then there was Catherine. She was staring at the uniform for the sanitation crew. It was a gray jumpsuit. It was the kind of thing she used to sneer at when she saw maintenance workers in her building. She looked at me, her eyes pleading one last time. "Lawrence," she said, her voice a husk. "Please. I am 60 years old. I cannot scrub floors. I cannot work the night shift. We were married for 40 years. Does that mean nothing?" "It means you should have saved some of the $3 million you spent on clothes," I replied. "It means you should have treated your husband like a partner, not an ATM. You wanted independence, Catherine. This is what independence looks like for people with zero assets and zero skills. You work. She didn't move to sign. She stood there frozen in her pride. And then the library door opened. A woman walked into the room. She was tall with silver hair tied back in an elegant knot. She wore a simple cashmere wrap and reading glasses perched on her nose. She held a first edition of The Wealth of Nations in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. It was Elena, the history professor I had been seeing for 3 months. She didn't look at Catherine with pity. She didn't look at her with scorn. She looked at her with a calm, intellectual curiosity. "Lawrence," Elena said, her voice warm and grounded. "I found that passage you were looking for, about the invisible hand of the market correcting inefficiencies." She walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of intimacy, of equality. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for status. She was just there, present with me. She was a woman who had her own tenure, her own pension, her own mind. She was my equal. Catherine looked at Elena. She looked at the book. She looked at the easy, respectful way Elena touched me. And in that moment, Catherine realized what she had truly lost. She hadn't just lost the house in Connecticut. She hadn't just lost the credit cards. She had lost the man. She realized that I wasn't just a checkbook. I was a person capable of connection, capable of intellectual depth, capable of being loved by someone who didn't need my money. She saw herself in the reflection of the window, old, tired, wearing ill-fitting clothes, about to become a janitor. And she saw Elena glowing with intelligence and grace, standing beside the man Catherine had thrown away. The realization broke her. Her shoulders collapsed. She reached for the pen. She didn't say a word. She didn't argue. She signed the contract for the sanitation crew. She accepted her fate. I gathered the papers. I tapped them on the table to straighten the stack. "Report to the foreman at 0600 hours tomorrow," I said. "Don't be late. The bus schedule is tight." I handed them the uniforms. They took them like prisoners taking their stripes. They turned and walked toward the elevator, a procession of the defeated. Brandon clutching his boots, Rachel clutching her dress, and Catherine clutching the gray jumpsuit that was now her future. Elena watched them go. Then she turned to me and smiled. "Are you okay?" she asked. I looked at the closed elevator doors. I looked at the signed contracts. "I am fine," I said. "I just hired 3 new employees. I think they are going to work out. They have a lot of motivation." I took Elena's hand. We walked back toward the library, leaving the empty water glasses and the ghosts of my past in the foyer. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. It was the end of the day, but for me it felt like the very first morning of the rest of my life. The sunlight in Tuscany hits the grapevines differently than it does anywhere else on Earth. It is a soft golden light that seems to slow down time itself, making the afternoon stretch into an eternity of warmth and peace. I sat on the stone terrace of a villa outside of Florence, a glass of vintage Chianti in my hand, watching the wind ripple through the olive trees. Elena was sitting across from me, reading a book of Italian poetry aloud, her voice blending with the chirping of the cicadas. We had spent the morning walking through a vineyard discussing history and art, and the only decision I had to make was whether to have the pasta or the fish for dinner. For the first time in 40 years, my shoulders were not tight. The constant hum of anxiety, the background noise of managing a family that resented me, had finally gone silent. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like earth and history. It tasted like freedom. 4,000 miles away, in the concrete belly of the Bennett Logistics Distribution Center in New Jersey, the atmosphere was very different. I opened my laptop not to work, but to check in. I had set a reminder on my calendar. 6-month review. I pulled up the live security feeds. Camera 4 showed the loading dock at 4:30 a.m. It was raining, a cold, sleeting rain that turned the asphalt into a slick gray mirror. My son Brandon was there. He was wearing the gray uniform I had given him, but it was no longer crisp. It was stained with grease and sweat. He was wearing a yellow safety vest and steel-toed boots that looked heavy on his feet. He was wrestling with a pallet jack trying to move a skid of industrial auto parts that weighed 500 pounds. He was slipping. He was struggling. A foreman, a man named Miller who had been with the company for 20 years and who took no prisoners, was standing over him holding a clipboard. I couldn't hear the audio, but I didn't need to. I saw Miller pointing at his watch. He was shouting. He was telling Brandon that the truck was leaving in 10 minutes, and if the pallet wasn't loaded, he could punch out and not come back. I watched my son's face. It was a revelation. The arrogance was gone. The sneer that used to appear whenever I asked him about his job search had been sanded away by 6 months of physical labor. He looked exhausted. He looked humbled. He gritted his teeth, dug his heels into the wet concrete, and pushed. He put his shoulder into the weight and forced the pallet up the ramp. He didn't complain. He didn't call his mother. He just worked. I switched the feed. Camera 9, the sub-basement. This was the archive division, a windowless room illuminated by the buzz of fluorescent tube lights. It was a place where time went to die. Rachel was sitting at a small metal desk surrounded by stacks of shipping manifests from the 1990s. Her job was to digitize them. Data entry, keystroke by keystroke. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wasn't looking at a phone because phones were strictly prohibited in the secure archive. She was staring at a monitor, her fingers flying across the number pad. 10 hours a day, no likes, no comments, no filters. Just raw data. I zoomed in. She stopped typing for a moment to rub her wrists. Repetitive strain was the new reality of her life. She looked at the stack of papers next to her where a tower that never seemed to get smaller. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I saw her lips move. She was counting. 1, 2, 3. Then she opened her eyes and went back to typing. She had learned focus. She had learned that the world does not applaud you simply for existing. You have to produce. I closed that window and opened the final feed. The sanitation department break room. It was 11:00 p.m., the start of the lunch break for the night shift. Catherine was sitting alone at a round laminate table. She was wearing the gray jumpsuit. Her hair was covered by a hairnet. She was eating a sandwich wrapped in foil. It looked like bologna on white bread. She chewed slowly, staring at the wall. Around her, other workers were laughing, playing cards, sharing photos of their children. They didn't talk to Catherine. Not because they were mean, but because she had spent the first month of her employment telling everyone she was the owner's wife and that this was all a mistake. They thought she was crazy. Now she was just the quiet older woman who cleaned the executive washrooms. I watched her finish her sandwich. She balled up the foil and threw it in the trash. Then she did something that made me pause. She walked over to the sink, washed her hands, and checked her reflection in the paper towel dispenser. She straightened her collar. She adjusted her name tag. She picked up her mop bucket. She wasn't slouching. She wasn't crying. She was doing the job. The woman who used to fire maids for leaving a streak on the mirror was now cleaning mirrors for minimum wage. And she was doing it with a strange, grim dignity. She had hit rock bottom and found that the bottom was solid ground. I looked away from the screen and back at the Tuscan landscape. Elena reached across the table and touched my hand. "Where did you go just now?" she asked softly. I looked at her. "I went to the office," I said. "Just checking on the new hires." "How are they doing?" she asked. She knew the whole story. She knew exactly who I was watching. "They are surviving," I said. "They are learning." I turned back to the laptop. I watched Brandon load the last pallet and wipe the rain from his eyes. I watched Rachel finish a file and place it in the completed bin. I watched Catherine wring out her mop and start on the hallway. For 40 years, I had given them money, and they had given me contempt. I had tried to buy their love, and I had only bought their entitlement. Now I was giving them nothing but opportunity, and for the first time in their lives, they were becoming people I could almost respect. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had fueled me in the courtroom, the cold fury that had driven me to evict them, it had all evaporated. What was left was a quiet satisfaction. I had saved them. I had saved them from their own uselessness. I hovered my mouse over the close button. I could have watched them all day. I could have gloated. I could have called the warehouse manager and told him to work them harder. But I didn't. I didn't need to. The system was working. The trust was secure. And I was retired. I clicked the X. The screen went black. The image of my struggling family disappeared, replaced by the reflection of a man who was finally free. I closed the laptop lid. It made a soft click. "Ready for dinner?" Elena asked, standing up and smoothing her dress. I stood up. I took a deep breath of the lavender-scented air. "Yes," I said. "I am ready." We walked out of the villa and down the cobblestone path toward the village. I didn't look back at the computer. I didn't check my phone. I left Lawrence Bennett, the CFO, the provider, the victim behind me. I was just a man walking into the sunset with a woman who loved him for his mind, not his wallet. My family was back in New Jersey, sweating, bleeding, and working. They were living the life I had lived for 40 years. And maybe, just maybe, in a few years, when they had calluses on their hands and humility in their heart, we could have a conversation. But not today. Today was for the Chianti. Today was for the silence. Today was for me. The sun dipped below the rolling hills of Tuscany, casting long shadows across the vineyard. I felt a profound sense of closure. The balance sheet of my life had been in the red for so long, weighed down by emotional debt and unappreciated assets. But as I walked hand in hand with Elena, I realized that for the first time the ledger was balanced. The debts were paid, the assets were performing, and the bottom line was finally undeniably black. I thought about Brandon on that dock. I wondered if he knew that the pallet jack he was using was the same model I had used in 1984. I wondered if Rachel knew that the data she was entering was the history of the empire that fed her. I wondered if Catherine knew that the floor she was mopping was the foundation of the life she had squandered. It didn't matter if they knew. They were living it. They were finally participating in the Bennett legacy, not as parasites, but as contributors. I had given them the greatest gift a father could give. I had given them the privilege of struggle. I stopped at the edge of the path and looked up at the first stars appearing in the twilight. I raised an imaginary glass to the west, toward New Jersey, toward the warehouse. "Keep working," I whispered to the wind. "You have a lot of catching up to do." Then I turned my back on the west and walked into the warm, inviting light of the trattoria, where a table was waiting for me. A table for two. No guests. No drama. Just peace. The apocalypse I had triggered 6 months ago had burned down the forest, but now looking at my life, I could see the green shoots of something new growing in the ashes. I had destroyed my family to save them, and in doing so, I had saved myself. I sat at the antique oak desk in the study of the villa, the late afternoon light spilling across the leather surface of my journal. I uncapped my fountain pen, the same black resin Mont Blanc I had used to sign the divorce papers 6 months ago. It felt different in my hand now. Lighter. Or perhaps it was just that my hand was no longer burdened by the tremor of suppressed rage. I watched the ink flow onto the cream-colored paper. For 40 years, I had written ledgers. I had written balance sheets and profit and loss statements. I had documented the rise of a logistics empire in columns of red and black. But tonight, I was writing something different. I was writing the epilogue to a tragedy I had personally engineered. They thought I was a relic. I wrote the words slowly, watching them form. That was their fatal error. Catherine looked at my gray hair and my sensible suits, and she saw a man who was finished. She saw a resource to be mined until it was empty. She forgot the fundamental rule of creation. The architect who designs the fortress knows exactly where the structural weaknesses are. He knows which pillar holds the roof, and he knows exactly how to pull it down to bring the whole thing crashing into dust. I paused, looking out the window at the rolling hills of Tuscany. The silence was absolute. No screaming, no demands for credit cards, no complaints about the quality of the caviar, just the wind and the birds. I continued writing. They called me cruel. They called me a monster for enforcing the contracts they signed. But is a surgeon cruel when he amputates a gangrenous limb to save the patient? My family was sick. They were infected with a rot called entitlement. It had eaten away their ambition, their kindness, and their humanity. I didn't destroy them to hurt them. I destroyed their lifestyle to save their souls, and if saving them meant I had to become the villain in their story, then I accept that role. I will wear the black hat if it means they finally learn how to tie their own shoes. I thought about Brandon struggling with the pallet jack. I thought about Rachel rubbing her tired wrists. I thought about Catherine looking at her reflection in the paper towel dispenser. They were miserable, yes, but they were real. For the first time in their lives, they were existing in the physical world, not a fantasy funded by my labor. I am not retired. I wrote, underlining the words. That is the greatest lie I told them. A man like me never retires. We just change projects. My previous project was the maintenance of a parasitic family unit. That project was a failure. It had a negative return on investment. So I liquidated it. I closed the division. I fired the staff. My new project is my own life. I am retiring from being a victim. I am retiring from the role of the silent wallet. I am retiring from the obligation to be loved for what I can provide rather than who I am. I closed the journal. The sound of the leather cover snapping shut echoed in the quiet room. It was a sound of finality. The book was closed. The ledger was balanced. I stood up and walked out of the study down the stone hallway to the garage. This was not the garage in Connecticut filled with leased SUVs and sensible sedans. This was a converted stable smelling of old stone and high-octane fuel. In the center of the space sat a machine that was less a car and more a declaration of independence. It was a 1967 Austin Healey 3000, British racing green. Wire wheels. It was a convertible with a long, sloping hood and an engine that growled like a cornered animal. I ran my hand along the cold metal of the fender. I had wanted this car for 30 years. I had found one for sale in 1995. It was perfect. I had brought the brochure home to Catherine. She had laughed. She called it a midlife crisis on wheels. She said it was loud, dangerous, and undignified. She said it would mess up her hair if we drove with the top down. She forbade it. She told me to buy a Lexus because a Lexus has good resale value. I listened to her. I always listened to her. I bought the Lexus. I died a little bit inside, and I drove a silent beige car that smelled like vanilla air freshener. Not today. I opened the driver's door. It clicked with a mechanical precision that pleased me. I slid into the low bucket seat. The leather creaked. The steering wheel was wood-thin and hard under my grip. There were no digital screens, no GPS, no heated seats, just dials and gauges and the smell of gasoline and oil. I inserted the key and turned it. The engine didn't purr, it roared. It coughed and sputtered, and then settled into a deep rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the chassis and into my bones. It was a raw, visceral sound. It was the sound of a machine that demanded attention. Elena appeared in the doorway of the garage. She was wearing a silk scarf around her hair and big dark sunglasses. She looked like a movie star from a bygone era. She didn't ask if it was safe. She didn't complain about the noise. She smiled a wild, reckless smile and opened the passenger door. "Where are we going?" she asked, shouting over the engine. "I don't know," I shouted back. "Does it matter?" She laughed and shook her head. "No, Lawrence. It doesn't matter at all." I put the car in gear. The shifter was stiff and mechanical. I released the handbrake. We rolled out of the garage and onto the gravel driveway, the tires crunching satisfyingly. As we hit the paved road, I pressed the accelerator. The car surged forward. The wind rushed over the windshield, tearing at my clothes, rushing through my gray hair. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was absolutely magnificent. I looked in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see the ghosts of my past chasing me. I expected to see a tow truck or a lawyer or a weeping wife. But the road behind me was empty. It was just a ribbon of asphalt stretching back into the distance, disappearing around a bend. There was nothing back there for me anymore. No debts, no guilt, no obligations. I looked forward. The sun was beginning to set over the Mediterranean, dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple fire. The road ahead was winding and dangerous and completely unknown. I shifted gears, pushing the engine harder. The tachometer climbed. The engine howled. I felt the speed pressing me back into the seat. For 67 years, I had driven with the brakes on. I had driven with a map drawn by other people. I had driven carefully, efficiently, and unhappily. Now I was driving for the sake of driving. I looked at Elena. She had her head thrown back, laughing at the sky, her hand resting on my arm. She wasn't holding on for safety. She was holding on for the joy of the ride. I tightened my grip on the wooden wheel. I felt the vibration of the road. I felt the power of the engine. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt since I was 20 years old. They thought they could break me. They thought they could strip me down and leave me for scrap. They didn't realize that under the suit, under the title, under the checkbook, I was made of iron. I drove into the sunset, the engine singing a song of redemption. The Bennett empire was safe. The lessons were being learned in a warehouse in New Jersey. And Lawrence Bennett, the man not the trustee, was finally exactly where he belonged, in the driver's seat. I shifted into fourth gear and let the car fly. The road was open. The tank was full. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the destination. I was just enjoying the ride. The most expensive lesson of my life wasn't taught in a business school or a boardroom. It was learned in the silence of an empty penthouse. For 40 years, I confused providing with parenting. I thought writing checks was a language of love, but I discovered it was merely a transaction that purchased their entitlement and my own erasure. True legacy isn't the millions you leave in a trust fund. It is the character you forge in the fire of necessity. I learned that you cannot save people from themselves by cushioning their fall. Sometimes you must let them hit the concrete so they can finally learn how to stand up. Freedom isn't about having enough money to do nothing. It's about having enough self-respect to demand everything you deserve. If you believe that respect is a currency that must be earned, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where justice is served cold. Let me know in the comments. Would you have hired them back, or would you have left them at the motel?